The key was still there, sitting on the windowsill like someone had set it down yesterday. I spotted it through the cracked glass when we pulled up to the old telegraph station just before dusk, the last of the sun turning the stone walls the color of rust. Emma saw me staring and leaned forward between the front seats. "Where are we sleeping, Dad?" "Out here," I told her, nodding toward the flat ground 50 meters from the building. "Not inside." "No, love." I didn't say the rest, that the roof looked ready to drop, that the door frame sat crooked in its arch, that sleeping in a ruin 200 k's from the nearest town was the kind of stupid that got people hurt. My wife Sarah caught my eye, and I saw the question there, the same one she'd been asking since we left the highway 3 hours back. "Why here?" "Because the kids wanted adventure. Because the caravan parks between Catherine and Alice all looked the same. Because I'd promised them something different, and this place had shown up on the map with a little square and the words Telegraph Station Ruins beside it." I killed the engine, and the silence came in hard. No wind, no birds, just the tick of cooling metal and the low hum of flies against the windscreen. Tom, our oldest at 12, was out before I'd set the handbrake, his door slamming loud enough to make Sarah flinch. "This is so cool," he yelled, already halfway to the building. "Stay out of there," I called after him. He waved without turning, and I watched him circle the walls, one hand trailing over the stone. Emma followed slower, her thongs scuffing up little clouds of red dust. Sarah sat still, her phone in her lap, the screen dark. No signal. She shook her head. Since the turnoff. I'd known that already. The last bar had dropped away somewhere past the cattle grid, but hearing her say it made the isolation feel heavier. "We're only here one night," I said. She nodded, still looking at her phone like it might wake up and prove me wrong. I stepped out into the heat, and it wrapped around me like a towel from the dryer, thick and dry and tasting of dust. The station sat in a shallow depression, low scrub stretching in every direction until it blurred into haze. No other buildings, no fence line, nothing but the road we'd come in on, and the single stone structure with its empty windows and sagging tin roof. Tom was peering through the front door now, his face pressed close to the gap. "There's stuff inside," he called. "Don't go in," I said again, louder this time. "Why not?" "Because I said so." Not my best work, but he stepped back, and I let the relief settle in my chest. Emma had found a stick, and was drawing lines in the dust near the car, her tongue poking out the side of her mouth, the way it did when she concentrated. Sarah climbed out and stood, with her arms folded, eyes on the building. "How long has it been empty?" I shrugged. 60 years, maybe more." She was quiet for a moment, then glanced back at the swags and camping gear piled in the tray. "We should set up before dark." She was right. The sun was already halfway down, and the shadows were stretching long across the ground. I dropped the tailgate and started pulling up the canvas, the tent poles, the blue cooler that had been rattling around since Catherine. Tom came over and grabbed the mallet without being asked, and I felt a flicker of something close to pride. Emma abandoned her stick art, and helped Sarah spread the ground sheet, the two of them working in the quiet rhythm they always found when it was just them. The tent went up fast, the 4-man dome we'd used a dozen times before, and I hammered in the pegs while Tom fed the poles through their sleeves. Sarah set up the camp chairs in a loose circle, and dragged out the gas cooker, setting it on the flattest patch of dirt she could find. Emma found the torch and clicked it on and off 3 times, testing the battery. By the time we had everything sorted, the sun was gone, and the sky had shifted from orange to deep blue, the first stars pricking through overhead. I walked back to the ute and pulled the UHF radio from the console, clipped it onto my belt out of habit. The station might be dead, but the radio still picked up the emergency channel, and out here that mattered. Tom was crouched by the building again, his silhouette sharp against the pale stone. "What's he doing?" Sarah asked. "Looking," I said. "At what?" I didn't answer, just walked over and stood beside him. He was staring through the window, the same one I'd looked through earlier. "See that?" he said, pointing. The Morse key sat exactly where I'd seen it, the brass dull in the last light, the wooden base, dark with age. "Someone left it behind," I said. "Why didn't they take it?" "Maybe they didn't need it anymore." Tom frowned, his forehead creasing the way it did when he was working through something. "Does it still work?" "I doubt it. Can we check?" "No." "Why not?" "Because it's not ours, mate." He stood and brushed the dust off his knees, still looking at the key. "It's just sitting there," he said. "Yeah. Seems like a waste." I put a hand on his shoulder and steered him back toward the tent. "Leave it." We ate tinned stew heated over the gas ring, the 5 of us sitting in a loose circle with our bowls in our laps. Emma asked if there were ghosts, and Sarah told her no, not in the way she meant, and I stayed quiet, because I didn't know how to explain the weight old places carried without scaring her. Tom wanted to know who'd lived here, and I gave him the short version. Telegraph operators, back when messages traveled by wire and Morse code, men who sat in tiny stations like this one, and tapped out news and stock reports and desperate calls for help. "How long did they stay?" he asked. "Months, sometimes. Alone?" "Mostly." He looked toward the building, and I saw him trying to picture it, the isolation, the heat, the endless days with nothing but the key and the wire and the static hum of distance. After we'd scraped the bowls and packed the cooker away, Sarah sent the kids to brush their teeth using the water bottle and the red dirt as a sink. I sat in my chair and watched the stars thicken overhead, the Milky Way spilling across the sky like something split open. "You okay?" Sarah asked. "Yeah. You've been quiet." "Just tired." She didn't push, just reached over and squeezed my hand once before letting go. The kids came back and we shuffled them into the tent, Emma curling into her swag on the left, Tom sprawling on the right. Sarah zipped the door and lay down between them, her torch clicking off a moment later. I stayed outside a while longer, the UHF radio still on my belt, the red LED blinking green every few seconds to show the battery was good. The building sat dark and silent 50 meters away, the key invisible now behind glass and shadow. I told myself it was nothing, just old junk left behind by someone who didn't care enough to carry it out. But I kept looking anyway, the shape of the window holding my attention longer than it should have. Eventually I stood and walked to the tent, unzipped the flap and crawled into my swag beside Sarah. She was already asleep, her breathing slow and even. I lay there staring at the canvas above me, listening to the silence press in from all sides. No wind, no engine noise, nothing but the sound of my own pulse in my ears. I closed my eyes and willed sleep to come, and for a while it almost did. I woke to the sound of tapping. At first I thought it was a branch against the tent, or maybe a stone cooling and cracking in the night air, but the rhythm was too regular, too deliberate. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. I lay there in the dark, my swag damp with sweat, despite the cool, and listened. The sound was faint, metallic, coming from somewhere outside. Sarah breathed steady beside me, the kids silent in their corner. I reached for my phone and checked the time, 2:14 a.m. The tapping continued, patient and unhurried, like someone practicing scales. I unzipped my swag as quietly as I could, and crawled toward the tent flap, my hand finding the UHF radio clipped to my belt. The green LED was still blinking, battery good, but when I thumbed the volume knob up, I heard it, the same tapping, fainter but unmistakable, crackling through the speaker. I froze, the radio cold in my palm. No one was transmitting. The channel was open, silent except for that rhythmic metallic tap bleeding through like interference. I turned the squelch down and the static rose, the tapping clearer now, deliberate dots and dashes that meant nothing to me but felt like they should. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. I switched the radio off and the sound stopped. I waited, listening to the night, then turned it back on. The tapping returned immediately, exact same rhythm, exact same cadence. My throat felt tight. I zipped the tent flap open and stepped out into the night, the red dirt cool under my bare feet. The stars were sharp overhead, no moon, just the hard white scatter of the Milky Way and the black shape of the building 50 meters away. I clicked on my torch and swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing moved. The ute sat where we'd parked it, the annex poles casting long shadows, the awning flapping once in a breath of wind I hadn't felt. I walked toward the station, the torch beam bouncing with each step, my pulse loud in my ears. The UHF crackled softly on my belt, the tapping still there, patient and endless. I stopped 10 meters from the building and raised the torch, the beam catching the window frame, the broken glass, the Morse key sitting on its wooden base inside. It looked exactly as it had at dusk, dusty, motionless, untouched. I walked closer, the dirt crunching under my feet, and pressed my face to the glass. The key sat still. No movement, no vibration, just brass and wood and shadow. But the tapping on the radio didn't stop. I stepped back and turned in a slow circle, the torch cutting across the clearing, the shed, the empty road beyond. Nothing. I walked around the side of the building, following the stone wall toward the back, and that's when I saw them. Boot prints. Fresh, clear, pressed into the thin layer of dust that covered the hardpan. They started at the corner of the building and led around back, the treads sharp enough to see the crosshatch pattern. Not mine. I was barefoot. Not Sarah's. Hers was smaller, and she was still in the tent. I followed them with the torch, the beam shaking slightly now, and stopped when they disappeared behind the building. The tapping on the radio cut out. Just like that, mid-rhythm, gone. I stood there in the sudden silence, the radio hissing softly, and felt the hair rise on my arms. I didn't want to go around back. Every part of me said turn around, walk back to the tent, wake Sarah, and load the kids and drive. But I didn't. I stepped forward, the torch held low, and rounded the corner. The back of the station was in worse shape than the front. Half the wall had collapsed inward, the roof sagging where the beams had given way. Old timber and sheet iron lay scattered in the dirt, rust and termite damage, and 50 years of weather doing what it always did. The boot prints led straight to a low mound of earth 10 meters from the building, then stopped. I walked closer, the torch beam fixed on the ground. The mound was old, maybe a meter long and half that wide, stones piled on top in a rough cairn. The dust around it had been disturbed, scraped away in places, footprints circling the edges. And beside the mound, half buried in the dirt, something metallic glinted in the torchlight. I crouched down and brushed the dust away with my fingers. A telegraph key. Smaller than the one inside, older, the brass tarnished black and green. The base was cracked, the spring rusted through, but the shape was unmistakable. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand, the weight of it solid and cold. The tapping didn't return. I stood there holding the key, staring at the mound, and felt something settle in my chest. Not fear exactly, but something close. A sense that I'd stepped into the middle of a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I backed away slowly, the key still in my hand, and walked around the front of the building. The clearing looked exactly as I'd left it. Tent dark, ute silent, stars overhead. I checked the UHF again, thumbing the volume up. Nothing but static. I walked back to the tent, unzipped the flap, and crawled inside. Sarah stirred, but didn't wake. I lay down in my swag, the telegraph key resting on the ground beside me, and stared at the canvas roof. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against my chest and focused on breathing, slow and even, the way you do when panic is close. The sound didn't come back. No tapping, no interference, just the hum of silence and distance. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten, the stars fading one by one, and somewhere in that last stretch of darkness I must have slept, because the next thing I knew Sarah was shaking my shoulder, and the tent was full of pale gray light. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah. You were breathing weird. Bad dream." She looked at me for a long moment, her face creased with concern, then nodded and crawled out of the tent. I heard her moving around outside, the click of the gas stove, the soft murmur of her voice as she woke the kids. I sat up and looked at the ground beside my swag. The telegraph key was still there, the brass dull in the morning light. I picked it up and shoved it into my pocket, then crawled out into the cool air. The sun was just touching the horizon, the sky streaked pink and orange, and the building sat dark and quiet 50 meters away. Sarah glanced at me as I stood, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You sure you're okay?" "Yeah." She didn't believe me, but she let it go. The kids stumbled out of the tent, Emma rubbing her eyes, Tom yawning and stretching in the red dirt. We ate breakfast in silence. Tin spaghetti heated over the stove, bread toasted on the flame, tea that tasted like dust and distance. And the whole time I felt the weight of the key in my pocket, pressing against my leg like a question I didn't know how to answer. After breakfast I told Sarah I wanted to have a look around the building properly, now that it was light. She gave me that look, the one that said she knew I wasn't telling her everything but wasn't going to push it yet. The kids were already halfway to the ruins, Emma pointing at something on the ground, Tom kicking at loose stones near the doorway. I followed the line of boot prints I'd seen the night before, the ones that led around the back of the building. In daylight they were clearer. Work boots, size 10 or 11, the tread pattern sharp in the dust. Fresh, maybe a day old, maybe less. They walked a deliberate path from the eastern wall toward a cluster of spinifex and mulga scrub about 20 meters back. I followed them slowly, scanning the ground. the air already starting to warm against my neck. The prince stopped at a low mound of disturbed earth, maybe 1.5 meters long, half a meter wide. The dirt was darker there, turned recently, and someone had placed 3 flat stones at one end in a rough cairn. No marker, no name, just stones and red dirt, and the quiet hum of flies beginning their morning rounds. I crouched down and studied the edges. The soil was loose, and something metallic glinted near the base of the cairn. I brushed the dust away with my fingers and pulled it free. A telegraph key, smaller than the one inside, rusted almost black, the brass contacts eaten through by decades of weather. I turned it over in my hands, the weight of it strange and cold despite the heat. Emma's voice carried from the front of the building, high and excited, calling for Sarah. I stood and shoved the key into my pocket beside the other one, then walked back around the building. Sarah was standing in the doorway, holding a book, her face pale. Emma was beside her, bouncing on her toes, talking fast about finding it on a shelf inside. I walked over and Sarah held the book out without a word. It was a logbook, the cover cracked leather, the pages brittle and spotted with mold. I opened it carefully, the spine crackling, and flipped through the entries. Station logs, daily reports, weather notes, all written in a cramped, precise hand. The dates ran from January 1931 to October 1932. The last entry was October 14, 1932. I read it twice, the words blurring slightly in the bright morning light. Cramped to bore 3 still silent. No response from Matheson since yesterday. Will ride north at first light to check lines, to Target Coppice, to Target Courts lines still sending coordinates in case anyone hears. Below that, written in a shakier hand, was a set of numbers. 23 degrees, 42 minutes, 18 seconds south, 133 degrees, 53 feet 06, E. I looked up at Sarah. She was watching me, her arms crossed, her mouth tight. What is it? She asked. Coordinates, for what? I don't know. Tom appeared in the doorway behind her, holding a piece of rusted wire and grinning. I found this, he said. Put it down, mate, Sarah said without turning around. He dropped it and wandered back inside. I closed the logbook and looked at the building, then back at the mound of earth behind it. Someone died here, I said quietly. Sarah nodded. The operator, probably. The last entry mentions a name. Matheson. I flipped back through the book, scanning the earlier pages. The name appeared a dozen times. Another operator, stationed at a bore site 8 kilometers north, regular check-ins, supply notes, routine traffic, then nothing after October 13th. The last line was still ringing in my head. Still sending coordinates, in case anyone hears. I pulled the rusted key from my pocket and held it out. Found this behind the building, I said. Near a grave. Sarah stared at it, her face unreadable. You think that's him? I reckon. And the tapping last night? I didn't answer. She reached out and took the key from my hand, turning it over slowly, her fingers tracing the corroded metal. We should go, she said. Yeah. But we didn't move. Emma came running out of the building holding a dented tin cup, and Sarah told her to put it back. Tom followed a moment later, slower, his face flushed and sweaty. Sarah noticed immediately and walked over, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. He's hot, she said. It's already hot. No, he's really hot. She led him into the shade of the building and made him sit, then pulled a water bottle from her pack and made him drink half of it. I stood there holding the logbook, watching the line of scrub to the north, the flat red stretch of nothing that ran for 100 kilometers in every direction. Tom started to cry quietly, his face pale now despite the flush, and Sarah looked at me with that expression I knew too well. We need to wait for the cool change, she said. I nodded. She was right. Driving him out now, in the midday heat, with early heat stroke setting in, would only make it worse. We'd wait until late afternoon, let the temperature drop, then head south. I walked back to the tent and pulled out the paper map from the glove box, spreading it flat on the bonnet of the ute. The coordinates from the logbook lined up with a bore site marked as Bore 3, 8 kilometers, almost due north of the telegraph station. Disused, according to the map, no road marked, just open scrub and salt pan. I folded the map and looked at the building. The UHF radio was still clipped to my belt, silent since dawn. I turned it on and cycled through the channels, listening to the empty static, then paused on channel 18. For a moment there was nothing, just the soft hiss of distance. Then the tapping came back, faint, rhythmic, the same pattern as before but slower now. I stood frozen, the radio pressed to my ear, counting the beats. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, a pause. Then a longer sequence I couldn't follow. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, then cut off cleanly, like someone had thrown a switch. I lowered the radio and looked at the building, my pulse hammering in my throat. Sarah called my name from the shade, her voice tight. I walked over, the logbook still in my hand, and showed her the coordinates. She stared at the page, then at me. "You're not going up there," she said. "Someone might need help. That was 90 years ago." "I know, so why would you?" "The radio," I said. "The tapping. It's still sending." She looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had, but the weight of the 2 keys in my pocket, and the fresh grave Outback, and the last desperate entry in the logbook, all added up to something I couldn't ignore. "I'll go this afternoon," I said, "before we leave, just to check." Sarah closed her eyes and pressed her fingers to her temples. Tom was leaning against the wall behind her, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow. "Fine," she said eventually. "But if you're not back in 2 hours, I'm driving him out and you can walk." "Fair enough." She turned away and knelt beside Tom, whispering something I couldn't hear. Emma was sitting in the dirt nearby, drawing patterns with a stick, humming to herself. I walked back to the ute and stood there in the rising heat, staring north toward the place the coordinates pointed, and wondered what the hell I was walking into. I sat in the ute with the engine off, windows down, letting the heat press in, while I tried to sort through what I knew and what I didn't. 2 days back we'd stopped at the roadhouse south of Wycliffe, well, the only fuel for 160 kilometers in either direction. The owner was a bloke in his 60s, lean and sun-worn, the kind who'd spent his whole life out here and wore it in the lines around his eyes. I'd mentioned we were planning to camp near Barrow Creek, maybe pull off near the old Telegraph station for a night, and his face had changed. Not dramatic, just a tightening around the mouth, a pause before he answered. "That's a rough spot to camp," he'd said. I'd laughed it off, said we'd camped in plenty of rough spots. He'd shaken his head, wiping his hands on a rag that might have been white once. "Not rough like that," he'd said. "Just, people don't stay there long." I'd asked why and he'd shrugged, non-committal, but his eyes had flicked toward the road north like he was checking something. "Old bones," he'd said finally. "Old stories. You hear things out there you can't explain. Best thing is to pack up and keep moving." I hadn't pressed him and we'd driven on, Sarah teasing me in the passenger seat about superstitious old-timers and how every second roadhouse had a ghost story to sell. But now, sitting in the ute with the logbook on the seat beside me and the memory of that tapping still rattling around in my head, I wished I'd asked more. The coordinates were simple enough, just a set of numbers scrawled in fading pencil beneath the last entry. The map showed bore 3 as a small circle with a cross through it, the standard marker for a disused site. No roads led to it, just open country, spinifex and low scrub, the kind of terrain that looked flat from a distance but hid washouts and rock slabs that could tear an axle clean off if you weren't careful. 8 kilometers wasn't far, not in a straight line, but out here straight lines didn't mean much. I looked at the fuel gauge. 3/4 full, more than enough. The sun was past its peak now, maybe 2 in the afternoon, the worst of the heat still ahead, but manageable if I kept moving. I glanced back toward the shade where Sarah sat with Tom, her hand on his forehead, Emma cross-legged beside them with her sketchpad. Tom's face was pale, his lips cracked despite the water we'd been pushing on him all morning. Heatstroke wasn't something you could rush, not safely. We'd have to wait for the cool change, another 4 or 5 hours at least, and I couldn't sit here that long doing nothing. The radio was still clipped to my belt, silent now, but the pattern it had played at noon was burned into my memory. I'm not good with Morse, never learned it properly, but Sarah had pulled up an app on her phone before the battery died and played the recording I'd made on the UHF. The screen had filled with letters as the algorithm worked through the beats. "Help trapped bore 3. Over and over, the same 6 words, no variation, no sign-off. She'd stared at the screen for a long time, then looked at me with something close to fear. "That's not possible," she'd said. "I know. So why is it happening?" "I don't know. But it's real," I'd said. We both heard it. She hadn't argued, just handed me the phone and walked back to Tom, her shoulders tight. I started the ute and let it idle, the engine noise a low rumble that felt almost comforting in the stillness. The map was marked with a route I could follow, or try to, skirting the worst of the salt pan and keeping to the higher ground where the scrub thinned out. If I kept a steady pace, I could be there in 40 minutes, maybe less, and back before Sarah's 2-hour deadline. I pulled the 2 Telegraph keys from my pocket and set them on the dash, the rusted one from the grave and the cleaner one from the station floor. They sat there side by side, small and ordinary, the kind of thing you'd walk past in a junk shop without a second glance. But out here, in this context, they felt heavy. I thought about the logbook entry, the operator's name, Donald Marsh, and the date, November 1932. Still sending, the last line had read, and below it the coordinates. No explanation, no context, just those 2 fragments, and then nothing. Whoever Marsh was, whatever had happened to him, he'd spent his last hours trying to get a message out, and somehow, 9 decades later, that message was still moving. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not the way people talked about them in stories, all rattling chains and cold spots and voices in the dark. But I believed in unfinished business. I believed that some things didn't settle, that they stayed raw and present long after the people involved were gone, and maybe that was all a ghost really was. Something left undone, something that refused to let go. I put the ute in gear and rolled forward, away from the shade and the ruins, turning north onto open ground. The scrub crunched under the tires, low and brittle, the kind that snapped like kindling underfoot. The land rose slightly, a long gentle slope that leveled out after a kilometer or so, and ahead I could see the shimmer of the salt pan, a pale scar cutting across the red dirt. I kept the pan to my left, following the line of the map, my eyes scanning for obstacles, for the sudden drop of a washout or the jagged edge of a rock shelf. The ute handled it well enough, the suspension groaning now and then but holding steady, and after 20 minutes I saw the bore. It wasn't much. A low mound of dirt and rubble, the remains of a casing that had collapsed inward, leaving a shallow crater maybe 3 meters across. A few warped sheets of corrugated iron lay half buried nearby, rusted through, and beside them a length of rotted timber that might have been part of a windmill frame once. I stopped the ute 30 meters out and killed the engine. The silence came back immediately, thick and oppressive, broken only by the faint tick of the cooling motor. I climbed out, the heat hitting me like a weight, and walked toward the bore, my boots scuffing through the dust. The crater was deeper than it looked, maybe 4 or 5 meters down, the edges unstable, chunks of earth and stone that shifted when I got close. I crouched at the rim and peered in, shading my eyes against the glare. At the bottom, half covered in debris, was a wooden cross. It was old, the timber gray and splintered, but the shape was unmistakable, 2 lengths of wood lashed together with wire. I couldn't see any inscription from where I stood, but I didn't need to. I already knew whose name would be on it. Donald Marsh. The operator. The man who'd sent the last message. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady, and looked around. There was nothing else here, no structure, no sign of habitation, just the collapsed bore and the cross and the endless stretch of red dirt in every direction. But Marsh hadn't been trying to save himself. The message wasn't about him. Help trapped bore 3. Someone else had been down there, and Marsh had died trying to get them out. I walked back to the ute, my heart pounding, and climbed in. The radio was still clipped to my belt, silent, but I turned it on anyway and cycled through the channels, listening. Nothing, just static. I looked at the 2 keys on the dash, then at the collapsed bore, and felt the weight of it settle over me like a stone. Whoever had been trapped down there in 1932 had never been found, and Marsh had died with their name still on his lips, still tapping out the coordinates, still trying. I started the engine and turned south, back toward the telegraph station, back toward Sarah and the kids, and wondered what the hell I was going to say. I made it back to the camp just after 4. Sarah was standing beside the patrol when I pulled up, her arms crossed, her face tight with worry. The kids were in the shade of the awning, Max lying on his back with a damp cloth over his forehead, Emma sitting beside him with a water bottle. I climbed out and Sarah crossed the distance between us in 3 strides. "You were gone 2 hours," she said. Her voice was steady but her eyes weren't. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." I reached for her hand and she let me take it, her fingers cold despite the heat. "What did you find?" I told her. "All of it. The collapsed bore, the cross, the timber frame, the crater where the casing had given way. I didn't soften it, and I didn't leave anything out." When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the dust at our feet. So he wasn't trying to save himself, she said finally. No. He was trying to save someone else. Yeah. She looked past me, toward the stone building 50 meters away, the broken walls and the cantilever, empty windows, and the shadows pooling in the doorway. And they never found them, it wasn't a question, not that I know of. She nodded slowly, then turned and walked back toward the awning. I followed, my legs heavy, and crouched down beside Max. His eyes were closed, but his breathing was even, the flush gone from his cheeks. How is he? Better, Emma said. He drank 2 bottles. Good girl. Sarah was standing with her back to us, staring at the ruins. I stood and moved beside her, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. We should leave, I said quietly. Soon as the sun's lower. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was flat. I decoded it. I turned to look at her. What? The tapping. The Morse code. She pulled her phone from her pocket and held it up, the screen showing an app I didn't recognize, a waveform display with letters scrolling beneath it. I recorded it this morning, she said, when it came back at noon. I didn't think it would work without signal, but the app runs offline. I stared at the screen, at the letters repeating in a slow, stuttering rhythm. Help trapped bore 3. Over and over. Jesus, I said. She lowered the phone and slipped it back into her pocket. He's still sending it, she said. Or something is. I don't know which is worse. I reached for her again, but she stepped away, her arms wrapping around herself. We need to tell someone, she said. The police, or the Historical Society, or someone who can do something about it. I will. Soon as we get to Alice. She turned to face me, her eyes hard. Do you think they'll find anything? After all this time? I don't know, maybe. She nodded once, then walked back to the kids. I stood there alone, the heat pressing down, the stone building silent and still in the late afternoon light. The radio on my belt crackled. I froze, my hand dropping to the unit, and lifted it slowly. Static. Then, nothing. I cycled through the channels, listening, but there was only the hiss of dead air. I clipped it back to my belt and turned toward the ute, and that's when I saw it. Fresh bootprints in the dust. Not mine, not Sarah's. Leading from the direction of the building, toward the edge of camp, then stopping 20 meters out, as if whoever had made them had stood there watching. I walked over slowly, my chest tight, and crouched beside the tracks. They were deep, the tread clear, the same pattern I'd seen the night before. But these were new. The edges were sharp, the dust undisturbed around them. I stood and followed the line back toward the ruins, my pulse hammering, and stopped at the threshold. The door was open. It hadn't been open when I left. I was sure of it. Sarah, I called. She looked up, her expression shifting when she saw my face. Stay with the kids. What's wrong? Just stay there. I walked into the building, the cool air inside a shock after the heat, and stopped in the center of the main room. The logbook was gone. It had been on the desk when we left this morning, the pages open to Marsh's last entry, and now the surface was empty, just dust and the faint outline where the book had been. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the shadows, the broken furniture, the gaps in the walls where the stones had fallen away. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like the space was holding its breath. I backed toward the doorway and stepped outside, the sunlight harsh and immediate. Sarah was standing now, her hand on Emma's shoulder, both of them watching me. The logbook's gone, I said. What? Someone took it. Her face went pale. We're leaving, she said. Now. I didn't argue. We packed in 10 minutes, throwing gear into the patrol, without bothering to fold or sort, Max leaning against the side of the ute with Emma beside him. Sarah moved fast, her hands steady, her jaw set, and I matched her pace, loading the awning and the chairs and the esky without a word. When we were done, I walked back to the ruins one last time, the radio in my hand, and stood at the threshold. The room was empty. The desk, the shadows, the faint smell of dust and old wood. I don't know what I expected to see. I keyed the radio and spoke into the static. We're going, I said. We'll tell them. I promise. The static hissed back at me, empty and cold. Then, just as I released the key, a single sound came through. A tap. Sharp and clear. Then, nothing. I stood there for 5 seconds, maybe 10, waiting. The radio stayed silent. I turned and walked back to the ute, climbed in, and started the engine. Sarah was already buckled in, the kids strapped into the back seat, Max's head resting against the window. "You right?" she asked. "Yeah. Let's go." I put the patrol into gear and pulled away from the camp, the stone building shrinking in the mirror, and didn't look back. We drove through the evening and into the night, the road unwinding beneath the headlights, the stars thick overhead. Max slept most of the way, and Emma dozed with her head on Sarah's shoulder. We reached Alice just after midnight and checked into a motel on the southern edge of town, a low brick building with a flickering neon sign and a tired clerk who barely looked up when I paid. I didn't sleep. Sarah lay beside me in the dark, her breathing slow and even, but I knew she wasn't asleep either. At first light I got up and drove to the police station on Parsons Street, a squat building with bars on the windows and a faded Australian flag hanging limp in the still air. The officer at the desk listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, and took notes on a pad in front of him. When I finished, he set the pen down and looked at me. "You sure about the coordinates?" he asked. "I'm sure. And the logbook?" "Gone when we left." He nodded slowly, then picked up the phone and made a call, speaking quietly to someone on the other end. When he hung up, he stood and gestured toward a row of plastic chairs against the wall. "Someone'll be out to talk to you in a bit," he said. "Might take a while." I sat and waited, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and thought about the boot prints and the tapping and the cross at the bottom of the bore. 2 hours later, a detective came out, a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and a no-nonsense expression, and took my statement again, this time with a recorder running. She asked good questions, specific ones, and didn't look at me like I was mad. When we were done, she switched off the recorder and leaned back in her chair. "We'll send someone out," she said. "Might take a few days to organize, but we'll check the site and the bore. Thank you." She nodded and stood, extending her hand. "You did the right thing." I shook it and left, the morning sun already fierce, and drove back to the motel. We stayed in Alice for 3 days while Max recovered and the heat broke. Sarah took the kids to the Reptile Center and the Telegraph Station Museum in town, the real one, with plaques and guided tours and a gift shop. I didn't go. I sat in the motel room with the curtains drawn and the air conditioner rattling, checking my phone every hour even though I knew the detective had said it would take time. On the 3rd day she called. "We found the bore," she said. Her voice was flat, professional. "And? There were remains. Human. Old, but we'll need forensics to confirm how old." I didn't say anything. "The site matches your description," she continued. "The cross, the casing, all of it. We're treating it as a recovery now, not an investigation." I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone pressed to my ear, and stared at the carpet. "What about the telegraph station?" "We checked that too. No logbook like you said. But there's evidence someone's been there recently. Boot prints, disturbed dust. Matches your timeline." I closed my eyes. "Thank you for letting me know. We'll be in touch if we need anything else," she said, and hung up. That afternoon we loaded the patrol and drove south, retracing the highway we'd come up on 2 weeks earlier. The kids were quieter than usual, subdued, and Sarah kept one hand on my knee as I drove, a steady pressure that said more than words. We passed the turnoff to Barrow Creek just before dusk. I saw the sign, faded white letters on brown, and kept my eyes on the road. Sarah glanced at me but didn't say anything. The sun dropped low, and the sky went pink and gold, the spinifex glowing in the last light, and we drove on into the dark. We stopped for the night at a roadhouse south of Tytree, a small place with a gravel lot and a single row of cabins out back. The kids ate toasted sandwiches in the diner while Sarah and I sat outside on a bench, the night warm and still, the stars beginning to show. "You think he knew?" Sarah asked. "The operator, that someone was down there?" I nodded. "I think he was trying to get help, and he died trying." "Yeah." She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder. "It's a long time to wait," she said quietly. 92 years. We sat in silence, the road train parked at the far end of the lot ticking as it cooled. And I thought about the message repeating in the dark, unheard, until we happened to stop in the right place at the right time. The letter came 4 months later, forwarded from our old address in Adelaide to the new place in the hills. It was from the Northern Territory Police, typed on official letterhead and signed by the detective I'd spoken to. It confirmed that the remains recovered from the bore had been identified through historical records as belonging to a stockman named William Cord, reported missing in October 1932 from a nearby station. The operator, James Hallett, had logged Cord's distress call on the day he disappeared, noting coordinates and a mention of an accident at a bore. Hallett had died of heatstroke 2 days later, found collapsed beside the telegraph key, his last transmission incomplete. The latter thanked me for reporting the findings and noted that Cord's descendants had been located and informed. A burial service had been held in Alice Springs the previous month. I read it twice, standing in the kitchen with the afternoon light slanting through the window, then folded it and put it in a drawer. Sarah found me there an hour later, staring out at the gum trees beyond the fence. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "Just thinking. About how long a message can travel. How far?" She stepped beside me and took my hand. "He got it through," she said. "Eventually. Yeah, eventually." That summer we drove north again, a different route this time, cutting west through the Flinders, and up into the Red Center, through Coober Pedy. The kids were older, more patient with the long days in the car, and we stopped at places we'd missed the first time, Painted Hills and Salt Lakes, and a meteor crater that shimmered in the heat. We didn't go near Barrow Creek. The highway split at Tie Tree, and we took the western fork toward Tennant Creek, skirting the area entirely, and no one asked why. But one night, camped beside a dry creek bed, under a sky so clear it felt like you could reach up and touch the stars, Max asked me if I still thought about the telegraph station. I was adjusting the awning on the patrol and I stopped, my hands on the canvas, and looked at him. "Sometimes," I said. "Do you think he's still there, the operator?" I shook my head. "No, mate, I think he's done." Max nodded, satisfied, and went back to poking the fire with a stick. But I thought about it later, lying in the swag with Sarah asleep beside me, and the Milky Way a bright river overhead. I thought about Hallett at the key, tapping out coordinates in the heat, his hands cramping and his vision blurring, knowing he was running out of time. I thought about Cord at the bottom of the bore, the water gone and the walls too smooth to climb, listening for the sound of help that never came. And I thought about the message traveling through the years, a faint pulse in the static, waiting for someone to hear it. "We're good at forgetting out here. The bottomer, land's too big, the distance is too far, and the heat burns away everything that isn't essential. But some things don't burn. Some things stay, pressed into the dust and the stone and the air, and they wait." I don't know if Hallett's still tapping. I don't know if the static carries his rhythm, or if it was just interference and bad timing, and a mind looking for patterns in the noise. But I know we heard something. And I know we followed it to the end. That's enough. We came home 2 weeks later, the patrol dusty and the kids sunburned and happy, and life went back to the way it was, work and school, and the small routines that fill the days. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I think about the long roads and the empty places and the messages we leave behind. And I think about the ones we're meant to hear. If you've ever driven the long road at night, you know the silence. Hit like and subscribe. More stories are coming.